You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. John is joined today by Dr. Graur. Dr. Graur is an Associate Professor of Astrophysics at the Institute of Cosmology and Gravitation at the University of Portsmouth. His research focuses on supernovae, transient astrophysical events, and their role in understanding the evolution of galaxies. He has made significant contributions to the study of Type 1a supernova progenitors, tidal disruption events, and the astrophysical processes behind cosmic explosions.
Dr. Graur, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, Doctor, you have some intriguing papers out regarding myths and how ancient peoples saw the Milky Way. As they looked into the sky, they see this strange smear of light that isn't quite like stars or anything else, or planets, or anything like that. It's just this smear. And there have been many myths over the years regarding it, and probably most of them we've lost. You know, people that were 40,000 years ago sitting around a fire looking up and wondering what that is. And these myths range from things like roads and rivers and even a shark, or in several cases a shark. But in your case, you were focused on Egypt, and that there might be a representation of the Milky Way in their artwork, and that they had some other myth above and beyond their sky god that involved this. Could you give us an overview of that?
So first of all, I got into the Egyptian angle because I was researching the worldwide, the multicultural mythology of the Milky Way. And I got into that only because I was writing a book about galaxies. So it's chance upon chance. And like you say, I was surprised to see that the kind of names and stories that I was encountering kind of kept repeating themselves. A road, a conduit between this life and the next, a river, some kind of god or animal, or some combination of all of these. And I wanted to feature stories from different continents and different eras. And I thought, what do we have from ancient Egypt? And I found that we don't really know. I found a few suggestions, and one of them looked very intriguing. One of them was a suggestion that the Egyptian sky goddess, who's called Nut, was also a representation of the Milky Way. That's because there's a very well-known, among Egyptologists, very well-known vignette in which Nut is shown as a naked woman, sometimes covered with stars, sometimes not, and she's arched. She's held aloft by her father, Shu, who is also the god of the atmosphere, or the god of air. And at her feet lies her brother and husband, Geb, who is the god of the earth. So what you have here is a kind of, the separation of the sky and the earth. And she's arched because, first of all, she's the sky. And when you look up at the sky, it kind of looks like this arched dome. And she protects the earth from being inundated by the flood water of the void that surrounds the world. And on her back, you often see the solar bark, this ship that ferries the sun god, Ra, along the sky. And some Egyptologists back in the 1990s had looked at this image and they said, this arched figure looks very much like what the Milky Way looks like in the Egyptian sky. It also looks like an arch. And so they said, okay, so maybe there's a connection between the two. Maybe they're one and the same. And they tried to then locate Nut's different body parts along the Milky Way. And there were two Egyptologists that did this. Each of them came to different conclusions. And I had set a rule for myself when writing this book on galaxies that I would only include stories that I could trace, that I could really trace back to the source and understand the arguments and have solid references. What I read wasn't solid. The arguments were not convincing, they were contradictory, they didn't look good enough. And I said, okay, well, I can't use it. I would love to because it's a beautiful image, but I can't. But as I was writing this book, I kept telling my daughters the different stories that I found. And this one really resonated with them. I had also found a children's book about the sky, different constellations, and they had a rendering of this, a bit more comical, a bit more for kids. But they really liked this, and we live not too far from a museum with a good Egyptian collection, and they had a few coffins with this image, and we went to see it. And again, it really, really resonated with them. They drew her, they know her, and I said, okay, this is a really powerful image. I really want to include it in my book. So I started digging deeper. I started looking into this myself. And at some point, I felt that, you know what, I can look into this myself. I can try and do some of this research myself. Even though I'm not an Egyptologist, I am not an archaeologist, I'm an astrophysicist. But I started looking into this from the point of view of an astrophysicist. I said, first of all, let's see what the Milky Way looks like in the Egyptian sky. I would love to go to Egypt and spend a lot of time there and watch the Milky Way in the night sky, but I can't do that. But we have planetarium software. We have a few such public pieces of software that anyone can use that uses, all the information we have about the orbits of the planets and the movements of the stars and everything, and we can use that to simulate what the sky will look like tomorrow, or 100 years from now, or 2,000 years ago. One of these is called Stellarium. It's one that I recommend to any amateur astronomer. It's very useful for creating your own observation plan. The other is called Carte du Ciel, which again is also public. And using them, I started looking, what would the Milky Way look like? And indeed, it does look arched some of the time. Some of the time it's very, very low on the horizon, and so would be actually very hard to see. Sometimes it's high up. I try to look at what does it look like on solstices and equinoxes. Is there anything of interest? And in parallel, I started reading Egyptian texts translated into English, because I don't read the hieroglyphs, but read the texts and see how Nut was described, how the sky goddess was described. And in one of these, I found a physical description. This is in a book which used to be called the Book of Nut, but back in 2007, an Egyptologist called Alexandra von Lieven discovered its real name. It's called The Fundamentals of the Course of the Stars, and it has a chapter on Nut and chapters on planets, and it's very interesting. And there's this description of Nut describes her mouth as being in the west, or the western horizon, and her rear as being in the east, or the eastern horizon. She's described as swallowing the sun as it sets, and then giving birth to it again as it rises the next morning. She's also described as swallowing and giving birth to certain stars. In Egyptology, they're called decanal stars, from the word deca, from 10, because the thinking is that they're used as a star clock during the night, where you know that if you wait 10 minutes after one asterism or star rises, you'll see that the next one rise. And so depending on which of the asterisms is already on the sky, you can tell the time. This is still a work in progress. Only some of these decanal stars have been matched with constellations that we recognize, or stars that we recognize. There are several Egyptologists who specialize in this. And that piece of information was already very interesting because that told me that the Egyptologists who had tried to map Nut's body onto the Milky Way were wrong. You can't do that. That's because the Milky Way rises and sets like all the stars in the sky. Now, that means that at any point during the night, you will see different parts of the Milky Way. Okay? But in order for Nut to swallow and give birth to the decanal stars throughout the night, her mouth needs to be locked onto the western horizon, and her ear has to be locked onto the eastern horizon. So she cannot be the Milky Way. Okay? On the other hand, there was another piece of information in that book about the orientation of her arms. And it described her arms with an orientation of 45 degrees. I never remember it exactly. One arm is on the northwest side and the other is on the southeast side. Not north and south, west or east, but specifically, northwest, southeast. So that was really weird, right? Why that 45-degree orientation? And that's where the planetarium simulations come in, because if you look at when the Milky Way is highest in the sky, so that it's easiest to see, then during the winter months, the Milky Way has that orientation in the sky. And then during the summer months, it flips so that it's at 90 degrees to the winter orientation. So that was interesting. That was the one piece of textual evidence that I found that might tie between the two. But again, that doesn't mean, in my view, that Nut and the Milky Way are one and the same. Then I wondered, or I conjectured, whether the Milky Way was used to kind of highlight her presence as the sky, thinking that, during the year, during the winter months, you would look up and you would say, oh, now I'm seeing where her arms are. And during the summer months, you would say, oh, now I'm seeing something different, maybe her backbone, although that doesn't sit quite right with the west-east orientation of her body. So that was my first paper, and I thought I was done. I had claimed that the previous suggestions didn't work, and I had a new suggestion, but it was clear that we needed more archaeological input, and that wasn't going to come from me. And so I felt okay to put that in the book. I had a paper out, and I was done. And I started giving talks about it because I like giving talks about my research, like all scientists. And I kept looking for variations of this image that I could use in my talks. And one day, when I was doing this, I found one version which gave me pause. This was from a coffin that's in the Odessa Archaeological Museum in Ukraine. And here again, you have the same thing. You have Nut, she's arched, she's covered with stars, Shu is holding her up, Geb lies beneath her, completely normal, except that there's also a thick, black, undulating curve that bisects her body. It runs from the tips of her fingers down to her toes, and the stars are on either side of this. And that caught my attention, because that to me looked like the Milky Way's Great Rift, this dark lane of nebulae that seem to bisect the Milky Way. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And I said, okay, I need to publish this. I need to show this. But I'm an astronomer, and whenever we find something strange, it's not enough to just say, hey, I found something strange. You want to be able to quantify how strange it is. So I said, okay, let's go and try and find as many of these images as I can, as many versions of this cosmological vignette, and see whether this black undulating curve appears more than once. So I really dived deep into this, created a catalog. I scoured the digital collections of museums around the world, and I have to say kudos to all the museums who have these digital collections that you can browse through. It's not like you need to be a scientist. You can just go onto the website of the British Museum or the Met or the Louvre, and you can search for anything you want or just click through everything. So I have a catalog now of more than 550 Egyptian coffins, and out of these, what was it? About 125 had versions of this vignette, but only that one had this undulating curve. So I still said I still want to show this, but now I can say that it's exceedingly rare, which to my mind says if this is the Milky Way, if this undulating curve is the Milky Way, then here, its rarity, I think, strengthens this idea that the Milky Way and the sky goddess are connected, but they're not one and the same. And I showed this to Egyptologist colleague who said, you know what, I think I've seen this curve or something like this in a couple of the tombs in the Valley of Kings. Why don't you check those out? And I checked them out and I said, hey, it does look like it. And I started looking through all the Valley of the King's tombs, and I found a few more of these. And that's when it became really compelling, because in many of these, you see this undulating curve bisecting astronomical ceilings or bisecting other books, the Book of the Day and the Book of the Night, which are always shown, they're shown on, the listeners can see my hands, but so if you look up at the ceiling in the burial chamber of, say, King Ramses IV, you will see two mirrored images of Nut. And under her arched naked body, you'll see all this hieroglyphic text. And these are the Book of the Day and the Book of the Night. Or in one case, the Book of the Day and the Book of Nut. So you have these mirrored visions of Nut, which Egyptologists understand as the day sky and the night sky. And between them, you have this undulating curve. And in one of these, the undulating curve starts at the base of Nut's head and then runs over her back and joins her rear, which to me says that it's connected to her. It's not just an artistic flourish. So what I now, and that brings up even more things. This undulating curve kind of looks like the hieroglyph for water, which looks like a zigzag. And then, it ties back to some other suggestions made by Egyptologists over the years. There are two cryptic terms in what's called the pyramid texts, the texts that were carved into the pyramids. One is, and I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, but one is Mesket Sechedu, the path of beaten stars or path of sailing stars, and the other is something called Mernecha, which is translated as the winding waterway or winding canal. And there are arguments in Egyptology whether these are, if one of them is the Milky Way and the other is the ecliptic, and if so, which is which. And I don't know exactly how to solve this. But Mernecha is interesting because in the pyramid texts are a collection of spells carved into the walls inside the pyramids in order to help the dead king make his way into the afterlife. Back in the Old Kingdom, when the pyramids were built, the afterlife was an astronomical thing. So the dead king had to rise up into the sky, and Nut was someone who helped him do it. She gave her hand to him or acted as a ladder. And then when he was in the sky, he had to journey across the sky. There's a ferry that would ferry him across the winding waterway from west to east. And when he got to the east, he could be reborn alongside Sach and Sopdet, which are understood to be at least part of Orion and the star Sirius. And then he could make his way up and join the imperishable stars, stars that don't seem to rise or set during the night. And in that way, he would achieve everlasting life. So Mernecha, this winding waterway, goes from west to east. So to my mind, that cannot be the ecliptic, which carries, it seems to carry planets from east to west. But a winding waterway could be seen as an undulating curve. They tie together, these things tie together. So that's the argument I now make, that I think the Milky Way and Nut are connected in the sense that Nut is the goddess of the sky. She has important roles to play as the sky, including in the solar cycle. She has to swallow the sun and give birth to it again. Because she's the sky, sometimes you see her during the day, just naked, and sometimes you see her during the night when she's covered with stars. And on some nights you also see the Milky Way. And perhaps the Milky Way is this Mernecha, this winding waterway. However, I don't have a smoking gun. I don't have a text that tells me this is what it is. I don't have something that says this thing that looks like, I don't know, a river or a ribbon of light, which I see when I see stars on either side. I don't have anything detailed, which we do have from many cultures. So some of this is trying to connect between different things we see in funerary papyri, on coffins, in tomb murals, and connecting that to texts from different eras, and trying to put together a picture that makes sense and is based on the evidence we have. So I try to have as little conjecture here as possible, but that's still hard to do, especially since with Egyptian history, we're talking about more than 3,000 years of history. And these different things, the coffins are from one era and the tomb murals are from another. And the pyramid texts are 1,000 to 2,000 years older than both of these. And we shouldn't expect any religion or any culture to remain constant over that kind of time. Look at our culture. Look at the religions we have today. They have changed dramatically over the last 2,000-3,000 years. So I'm offering a new story. It's based on as much evidence as I can find, but readers of the papers and listeners to this podcast should always take these stories with a pinch of salt. They should always ask, what is this based on? What's your evidence? And where have you taken, flights of fancy or conjectures?
Which is how all science works. Astronomy certainly does, or it's supposed to. Sometimes it doesn't. Now, there are interesting parallels here because you mentioned the Valley of the Kings. Sometimes you just see in Egyptian tombs, the ceilings are just covered with stars.
Yes.
And that alone just tells you the importance of the night sky to them, especially if they're using it to tell time, which, it's a very logical thing to do when you don't have the sun. And the other thing is that holding back a flood, well, the elephant in the room for ancient Egypt is the Nile, which is a winding river. Not really very winding, but it is a river, a waterway, paralleling the sky. Did you find any connection that they were seeing it sort of as above and so below type of a viewpoint, that this might have something to do with cycles of the Nile's flooding, for example?
No, I didn't find anything like that. That's a suggestion that I saw floating around the internet on some websites, but I found no piece of evidence for this in anything that I've seen.
Now, as a 2025, an astrophysicist, and we know what the Milky Way is, we know what those dark veins are, we've discovered all of that stuff. Do you feel a connection, at least in logic, to these ancient astronomers that were looking at that, trying to come up with whatever interpretation they had culturally? Do you feel a connection to those ancient astronomers as they looked at the night sky so long ago?
I do. I didn't used to. I never really thought about this until I started looking into the multicultural mythology of the Milky Way. And that really created a connection. I felt like I was I was, it felt like I was reading, not papers, but reading things written by colleagues or told by colleagues, just colleagues from 5,000 years ago. The way I see it, maybe because I'm an author as well as a scientist, but everything we do is narrative driven. We tell stories about the world, we tell stories about ourselves. Why do we have so many songs about love and death? It's because we need to explain things to ourselves. And the stories we weave are based on the tools and understanding we have at any given point in time. And so 5,000 years ago, our ancestors, they lived in a world in which the best explanations they had for phenomena were gods. There has to be some hidden power that creates everything and makes everything work. And this is what they used. These were the tools. This was the theoretical framework, if you'd like. And with this, they explained their observations, but they still made detailed observations. That's one of the beautiful things you see when you read what little evidence we have from ancient Egypt. You see a detailed understanding, the phases of the moon and the sun's journey across the sky, all 5 visible planets. They had a good astronomical understanding, and we think they used the astronomical understanding to orient the temples and monuments. So this also became a tool for them, right? And then as you go on throughout history, the theoretical frameworks shift, they change. You get to a point where what you had no longer works for you, and you need to come up with a new framework. And you call it something else. You call it philosophy, or you call it another religion. Another religion comes along. And over time, we develop better tools. We develop telescopes, and now we can see that the Milky Way is made up of stars. And now we can see that some of the blobs that you could see with the naked eye are actually, they might be something else like the Milky Way. And so things evolve, but the basic idea remains the same. I look around at the world around me, I make detailed observations, and then I try to explain them with some kind of story. And that's where we are today as well. We have a language that we use, we have math. We use that to create mathematical descriptions of the phenomena we observe. We are, I would say, one step ahead in that our mathematical models also give us predictions that we can test. But then when we talk to other people, we still have to use human language, and we still have to explain this. And so we still revert to stories. And so we talk about the Big Bang, and we talk about the expansion of the universe, things that we still don't understand, things that our mathematical frameworks we know are not good enough, right? And so there will come a point, maybe 10 years from now, maybe 100, maybe 1,000, when there will be a different theoretical framework. There will be other tools, maybe different languages, and we will understand the world in a different way, maybe a completely different way, right? We no longer think of the sky as a goddess. We don't think of the Milky Way as a river or a road. But 2,000 years from now, will we only think of it as a galaxy? I don't know. Will we think of the universe the way we think of it now? I don't know. What I am pretty sure of, though, is that we will still think about these things in terms of stories.
Well, I don't think there's any question of that. That again, it's a process of revision. So even what we know about ancient Egypt, one text might tell you what that we haven't found yet, might tell you what you need to know to validate or invalidate your hypothesis, and it just hasn't been excavated yet, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And especially with Egypt, because there is a lot left that has not been touched. The archaeologists will be working for centuries on that still.
Just a few weeks ago, a joint British Egyptian expedition, and they think that they have a lead on a second tomb of his, because the one they found was empty. It doesn't seem to have ever been used. So they have a lead on maybe the real tomb. And there are hundreds or thousands of papyri that were excavated decades ago that still need to be read and translated. There is a lot of work in this field. There's a lot more Egyptian archaeology than I knew about before I started looking into this.
Oh, it's just as bad as astrophysics. There's still so much work left to do. And within astrophysics, of course, there's entire areas. How a quantum theory of gravity, we don't even really have that, So these big questions remain, and it's a work in progress. But it's interesting because you point out something that in the future they may look back at us in 2025 as, oh, they didn't have a very complete understanding at all, and that we become the hieroglyphs.
Well, we don't have a complete understanding. The one thing I hope they won't look back on us and use words like primitive.
No, that's not a good word, and I would never say that about honestly any human group, because you look in a cave painting from 40 or 50,000 years ago. No, that's not primitive. That's art, and it's contextual. You are a product of your times, but you're still human. Therefore, you could go back and get one of those Egyptian astronomers and put them in a university and have them learn a living language and become a PhD astrophysicist today with a very interesting perspective on the past, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the things that I want to emphasize and just correct with the papers I write about the multicultural mythology of the Milky Way, whether it's about civilizations, cultures from 5,000 years ago, or cultures today, living cultures all over the world. We're all the same. One of the beautiful things about this, the fact that you have these basic motifs that keep recurring, shows that there's a shared imagination that we keep drawing from. Because I see these in cultures that are disconnected geographically and in time from other cultures. So this undulating curve, for example, one of the reasons that I latched onto it is because I've seen versions of the Milky Way as an undulating or zigzag curve in southwestern Native American cultures. In Navajo sand paintings of Father Sky, on Hopi and Zuni Katsinas. I've seen this, right? And there is no connection between ancient Egypt and the people of North America. And so that, again, gives me this basis to think that this undulating curve on Nut is the Milky Way.
And that's just to the human eye, maybe. Have you ever sat down and looked at the Milky Way at night and tried to see that? I mean, because even, when you see the dark spots, the veins, maybe it does look like a zigzag line in a certain sense. What do you think about that?
So in images, in photographs of the Milky Way, yeah, you can look at it and you can see it's not a perfect zigzag, but you can see something that seems to undulate. Now, I've lived in cities all my life. So the first and so far the only time I've seen the Milky Way was when I was out observing at an observatory in the desert, and there was no light pollution, and the Milky Way was up. It was the first time I had seen it, and it was a bit of a shock. It takes up quite a bit more of the sky than you would think. And remembering that also motivated me to talk about light pollution. So in both my books so far on supernovae and on galaxies, there are chapters devoted to light pollution and its effects on us, on other animals and birds. And one of these effects is the fact that I can't see the Milky Way in the night sky outside of my house. I can't show it to my daughters just by going outside. And so we have become disconnected, not just from the sky, not just from stars, but we've become disconnected from our own past. We've become disconnected from these stories that to our ancestors, were part of their everyday life. And for us today, you have to drive to a national park or somewhere where there's really zero light pollution in order to really see the majesty of the Milky Way.
It's true. Light pollution only gets worse. As an amateur astronomer myself, living in a city that I can just see a smattering of stars, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But not a total disconnect, because things like there was an enormous display of the aurora borealis down here not long ago during a solar storm, and you could certainly see it.
Mm-hmm.
But also things like the dimming of Betelgeuse, if you remember that happening several years ago, where it dimmed and then recovered. It belched out a dust cloud or carbon cloud or something like that. But at the same time, you look into the history of astronomy and you run into the ancient Chinese astronomers who were describing Betelgeuse a different color than it is today.
I don't know about that. I know that Sirius was described as having a different color by certain cultures.
Yeah, there were actually two of them. It was Betelgeuse, and then I've heard of the Sirius one as well. Although the Sirius one gets a little bit dangerous because there was a case of archaeological contamination where a group of people in Africa called the Dogon they were aware of the white dwarf companion. And in the 1950s, anthropologists went in there and said, well, how do they know this? Well, the fact is that a bunch of anthropologists had been through there when that was discovered and told them. And they were just saying, yeah, we heard about that someone had discovered this companion star. And then when somebody in a modern context, an anthropologist went in there in the 1990s, the Dogon themselves said that that's what happened, that they were told about it, and that a bunch of different people remembered it differently. But a very old member of their community was like, yeah, that happened a long time. They told us that. So it turned out to be a complete misconception that used to make it into all kinds of popular television, when in fact it was never really the case, because they were in contact with modern scientists. Which also makes this difficult because,
Mm-hmm.
you can't look in an archaeological context. It gets kind of dangerous to talk to the people that descend from them today, because we're all part of this gigantic modern world. But strangely, and I wanted to leave you with this, there are uncontacted peoples on Earth still, just a few groups. And one of them came into contact out of necessity. They contacted us out of necessity about 10, 12 years ago. And I happen to know what their myth was on the sky. And once again, I don't know if this correlates with the Milky Way, but they believed that it was a road of souls and that your soul would ascend to the heavens and follow a river.
Are you thinking of Brazil?
Yes, this was in Brazil. I don't know the name of the group, but they took a very severe hit because they got into a conflict with poachers and they lost a large amount of their people. So they had to go make contact with the local friendly people. And that was one thing that they said. They're trying to document what this uncontacted tribe believed. Unfortunately, there's also contamination there too, because they knew more about us than we knew about them. So they knew what things like the Peruvian army were and things like that. They had an understanding of us, whereas we were thinking, well, we don't know what they think because we're not in contact.
So a road of souls would make a lot of sense for the Milky Way, not just because we see this across cultures all over the world, but we see this in many cultures in the Americas, all across North America, South America. So even if it could have, they could have originated it themselves. They could have come in contact with the Inca or Maya or other peoples living in South America. It's a very common motif.
Yeah, and there's also the question of how long do stories last? I actually know a radio astronomer in Australia, and his interest is in studying what the original peoples of Australia actually knew about the sky, which was very advanced. They actually knew that solar eclipses were the moon. They knew that, whereas not all cultures did. But they also talk about the Pleiades as the seven sisters, as a variant of that story, which is not all that different from the folk story of the Greeks, which is, again, the same theme. So the idea is that maybe this is a story that was around when all these people were still in contact, meaning that it's a 100,000-year-old folk story before all of these groups of humans diverged and went all over the earth, and that some seed remnant of a story back then that was shared is still with us about the Pleiades. And the odd thing about it is that it actually says seven sisters, but if you look at the Pleiades without a telescope today, you only see six, but back then you saw seven, because there actually are seven stars involved. They're just two of them are too close now to resolve with the human eye. They're interesting ideas, but again, how do you prove it? Because you're trying to look back in the past, and the people that you could have interviewed have been dead for 100,000 years. And here the Egyptians, 5,000.
There is no way to prove this. Here, I kind of revert to Occam's razor. We have two suggestions here. One is that what you're saying is that all stories derive from some Ur story from 10,000, 20,000 years ago, and that story has persisted. The other suggestion, my suggestion, is that we have lots of different stories. Some of them, some even large fraction of them, are very similar to each other because they all derive from a shared imagination, just the way our brain processes the images it sees in the night sky. Occam's razor would ask you, okay, which one is simpler? I have to say, in this case, it's hard to say, but there is some evidence tilting towards the shared imagination. So there was a paper, I think it was in 2023 or 2024. I can find you the paper, I can send it to you by email, that looked at the way different cultures organize stars into constellations. And some of the constellations repeat in different cultures. And that's just because of the way we perceive patterns. You know, it's like you go around and you see faces on everything. You look at a fire hydrant and you see a face. There is no face there, okay? But every human will see a face because that's how we're wired. And the same thing, you look up at the sky, you see this bunch of stars, the Pleiades, and you say, okay, that's important. And you look at another bunch of stars nearby, and you call that Orion the Hunter, or something like that, or you call it Sach, or something. And you look at another bunch of stars, and you call it the Bear or the Plow. But here you start to see, right, the Bear or the Plow, two very different stories. But in the ones where you have a hunter, the hunter hunts something. In some versions, the hunter hunts the bear, and you see that in the Arctic Circle, and you see some versions of this in North America. And here you can say, okay, the Arctic Circle connects everything. And then you look at these Pleiades and you say, okay, so maybe the hunter is hunting them. What would the hunter be hunting? What would the man be hunting? And you go with, okay, so he's chasing seven sisters. So there are different numbers, different ideas what these could be. But that's how you build the stories over time. You see the patterns. First you look up and you see, okay, there's something that looks like a zigzag, something that looks like whatever. And then you build a theoretical framework for it. And I don't have any proof. I don't even know how to do something like this. As a writer, not as a scientist, just as a writer, as a human, I like the idea that this pattern recognition and these stories come from a shared place, come from from a shared imagination, from a way that we just see the world in similar ways. And this is why we can read literature from other cultures. It's why I can love the stories written by Garcia Marquez and by Kenzaburo Oe. And it's why I can read ancient Egyptian poetry written 3,000 years ago and recognize things. There's a beautiful poem, the Harper's poem, where he basically says, enjoy life now, for tomorrow we die. Enjoy the things you have now because you can't take them with you. And I think that will resonate with many listeners because we have heard other versions of this. We have read other versions of this. And I'm not going to say that they all descended from this ancient Egyptian poem. I think they all come from the way we look at life, the way we look at death, the way we look at the sky.
Indeed, it's the common human experience. All right, thank you, Doctor.